I guess most of you slept last night, but why do we do that? Why do we sleep? What is it good for? Matthew Walker promises to enlighten us in his book, Why We Sleep. And today we're going to take a look at that. Welcome to the Soft Skill channel. My name is Sebastian Jung and I welcome you to another book review. Today we will have a look at Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep. There is, by the way, this edition I have here with the subtitle The New Science of Sleep and Dreams. And there is another edition with a blue cover, an image of the moon, and the subtitle Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. But this is merely branding, the content is the same. So we have a book about a very basic topic, sleep. Matthew Walker is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California in Berkeley, and he is a sleep researcher. And his findings he describes in this book, Why We Sleep, that he published in 2017. And it was and is quite a successful book, an international bestseller. However, there are some problems in regard to the book that we will discuss in the critique. For now, we will have a look at the content. The book is divided into 4 parts, each with several chapters, and I will give you a rough overview. The first part of the book provides a basic understanding of what sleep is and how sleep works. For example, we learn about the basic mechanisms that determine our sleep and wake cycles. There is the so-called circadian rhythm, which is basically our internal biological clock. And there is a substance called adenosine that is produced throughout the day and makes us tired. And when we go to sleep, it is dissolved, so we are refreshed again. And how those two mechanisms interact, you can see if you stay awake an entire night. You've probably done so before, and you might remember that the night was quite difficult. You were really exhausted, really tired. But when morning came, the situation improved a bit and you were a bit more awake. Still exhausted, but more awake. And the reason is that you still have all of this adenosine that you didn't get rid of and that makes you tired, but your circadian rhythm tells you, oh well, it is morning again, a good time to be awake. We also learn about the difference between NREM sleep and REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement because in this phase of sleep our eyes move behind their lids because this is the phase where we dream. In NREM sleep we don't dream, and there are different stages of NREM sleep ranging from very light sleep to very deep sleep. There are 4 stages that are distinguished between. And during a good night's sleep we keep alternating between NREM sleep and REM sleep. In the first part, there is also a short excursion into the animal kingdom with some quite interesting facts. For example, some sea mammals like whales and dolphins and also some kinds of birds are able to actually sleep with half a brain. Imagine several birds sitting next to each other on a fence. The birds in the middle are completely asleep. And the bird on the very right, he only sleeps with the left part of his brain, and the right part is still awake, and he keeps an eye out for danger, for predators, and likewise the bird on the left side. So there are some fascinating stories there. In the first part, Walker also discusses sleep in the cycle of our lives, from a little baby to old age. One thing I found very interesting here is that, contrary to popular belief, old people don't need less sleep. They need just as much sleep as younger people, but it is more difficult for them to actually get it. In the second part of the book, we learn about the value of sleep, all the positive effects it has, and all the problems that arise from sleep deprivation, from lack of sleep. First of all, good sleep supports our memory in several ways. After we've had a good night of sleep, we are able to learn better and to acquire new information better. And after learning new things, if we sleep well in the nights after, this new information is stored better and for a longer time. And we even work with the knowledge we have acquired during the night and develop it further. More about that in the part about dreams. On the negative side, we have several problems that arise from lack of sleep, for example, in regard to our ability to concentrate and our attention and our reaction times. Here, the so-called microsleep is a big danger. Those are moments where you fall asleep for just a brief moment, just 1 or 2 seconds maybe, and you don't really notice it, but you can't really react or do anything for a short, brief moment. And this can be quite dangerous if you are driving a car at that moment and are going at high speeds. Walker describes a very interesting study here. Participants were divided into 3 groups. One group was allowed to sleep for a full 8 hours, one group only got 6 hours of sleep, and one group had to stay awake the entire night. And then all the participants had to do several tests where their focus of attention and reaction times were examined. At first, results were pretty obvious. Those who had full 8 hours of sleep had great results. Those who had to stay up all night had very bad results. And those with 6 hours of sleep were not as good as those with 8, but not that much worse. However, the interesting thing is this experiment continued for several more days, and each day the performance of those sleeping only 6 hours decreased further and further. And after 10 days, the performance of those sleeping only 6 hours was just as bad as the performance of people who had stayed awake an entire night. And this is, of course, interesting. If we don't get enough sleep, we won't just be on a steady level of not as good as someone who has slept well, but our performance will keep decreasing over time. And there was another interesting effect in regard to that study. They also interviewed the participants, asked them, how do you feel? How do you rate your own performance? And those who slept 6 hours and had decreasing performance, they believed that they were awake and fit and in a good condition, and their reaction times were great, pretty much like someone who's had a couple of drinks and says, oh, I think I can still drive my car, I'm quite confident. So this is also quite risky and quite interesting. In this second part, Walker also explains where the term power nap comes from. It's actually from the aviation industry. A while back, the FAA, the US Federal Aviation Authority, asked 2 scientists, one Dr. Dinges and one Dr. Rosekind, to clear up an important question. During long flights, pilots have to stay awake for a long time, 36 hours, something like that. And bad thing is, the landing is at the very end, and the landing is the most difficult and the most dangerous part of the flight. So the FAA wanted to mitigate, to lower the negative effects of sleep deprivation. So they asked, if those pilots can only get a short nap of 40 to 120 minutes within this 36 hours, what is the best time for them to take it? Beginning of the night, middle of the night, end of the night? And Dinges and Rosekind found out the best timing is to take the nap at the beginning of the night. This will, due to this, the effects of sleep deprivation will be a bit less and will not be as strong as they would usually be. So they proposed to call it a prophylactic nap. But the FAA said no, pilots would make jokes about that, they wouldn't take it seriously. So Dinges proposed planned naps. However, this was too management-like for the FAA, and the FAA in the end decided to call it power naps, because this would sound cool to the pilots and the pilots would accept that. So this is quite interesting because it's quite different from the ideas I have in my mind if I hear about power naps in day-to-day life. In this second part, Walker also talks further about relationship between sleep and mental illnesses. He discusses relationships between sleep and Alzheimer's disease. At length, there are some interesting connections there. And he also discusses sleep and physical problems, lack of sleep and physical problems such as elevated blood pressure and elevated blood sugar levels that occur due to lack of sleep. And of course, they lead to all the problematic results we know, such as increased risk of stroke, increased risk of diabetes, and so on. The third part of the book is about dreams. Here Walker talks about dreaming. He says due to modern imaging techniques, we have a better insight into dreaming and we can get a new knowledge, new results, and we can refute older, simpler explanations such as Sigmund Freud's ideas about dreams and interpreting dreams. And one very interesting piece of knowledge is that dreams are not merely a byproduct of sleep. Dreams have their own value. For example, Walker describes how emotionally stressful experiences are better processed if we sleep and dream the nights after. He calls this a kind of overnight therapy. And he also discusses positive effects on creativity. There are plenty of stories of people who claim to have great ideas that came to them in their dreams, such as the creator of the periodic table, or also the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. There are some songs that are supposedly came to them in their dreams. Finally, one aspect I found quite interesting is that when we sleep and dream, we continue to work with the knowledge we've acquired and we perform problem solving. For example, think of little children that learn a language for the very first time. Little kids are able to form grammatically correct sentences before they go to school and learn about the rules of grammar for the first time. So obviously they listen to all the language that they hear and they are able to figure out the overarching rules and structures that govern that language, the way the language works, and so they can form grammatically correct sentences. And this kind of figuring out structures and rules and analyzing data, this is something that occurs when we are asleep and dream. Walker describes an interesting study here. In the study, participants had to solve difficult number puzzles. And there was a secret hidden rule to those number puzzles. They had something in common, and if you figured this out, it became much easier to solve them. Now, participants had to do different sessions, and some of them had to take all those sessions within one day, morning, afternoon, and so on. And some of the participants took the sessions on 2 days, so they had sessions in the afternoon, in the evening, and on the next morning, and in between they had a chance to sleep. And it turned out those participants who had all their sessions on the same day, of those only 20% were able to figure out the hidden rule, but of those who had a chance to sleep in between, 60% were able to figure out the hidden rule. So this is quite an interesting study. Finally, part 4 of the book deals with sleep disorders and remedies. Here Walker describes a couple of medical issues that can arise in relation to sleep, such as sleepwalking or insomnia. And he also describes more common problem factors that make it more difficult for us to get a good night's sleep, such as artificial light or alcohol. And he talks about the remedies we use against problems with sleep, against problems falling asleep and the like. And first he discusses sleeping pills, where he describes a lot of problems. For starters, sleeping pills don't really induce natural sleep, but the state we experience after taking sleeping pills is more like sedation. And since it's not actual sleep we don't get all the positive effects of sleep. And there are more problems in regard to sleeping pills that Walker describes. But he also describes a better alternative, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. There, the therapist helps the patient to establish a better sleeping routine, better sleep hygiene, so the patient can learn to sleep better using natural means without medication. And this cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia actually works better than sleeping pills. In this part, Walker also discusses sleep as a social problem, as a general problem of society. He talks about different aspects, for example, about business. Because in the business world, paradoxically, on one hand, a lack of sleep decreases and hurts a lot of those competences and skills that are important in business, such as concentration, creativity, and many more that Walker describes. But on the other hand, in business, sleeping very little is often viewed as something positive, as something that means like great discipline or something like that. So there are some problems there. Another area that Walker discusses is school. School is a topic he picks up frequently throughout the book, and here he does so again. And the main problem he sees is that school starts too early. Because as we learn in the chapter about sleep in our life cycle, teenagers have a sleep rhythm that moves back, so they get tired later in the evening and they wake up later in the morning. And if school starts very early, it of course is in conflict with a natural rhythm of sleep. And the experience showed that if schools move their starting times further back, such as from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m., that students actually get better results and better grades. In this fourth part, Walker also talks about perspectives for improvement. So for solving this social problem of lack of sleep. He places a lot of hope on technological progress. He describes a scenario that goes about like this. We could have devices that measure our sleep and that help us figure out our natural rhythm for good sleep. And then this is connected with a smart home environment. So the lighting in our home, the temperature in the room and things like that are automatically adjusted to our natural sleeping rhythm. So technology can actually help us get a better sleep. And of course, Walker also places a lot of hope on increased awareness for the issue of sleep and for the importance of good sleep. So this is, of course, also an important aspect. At the very end of the book, there is a short conclusion, just one page, where Walker again emphasizes that sleep is important, but neglected and underrated, and that this is a big challenge for us. And there is a short appendix, 2 pages that contain 12 tips for better sleep. So let's proceed to the critique. I like the basic concept of the book, Walker's basic approach. He says sleep is important but undervalued. Think about school, for example. At school we learn that exercise and sports are important for our health, or that a healthy diet is important for our well-being. And there are public awareness campaigns for things like safer sex, or not driving while you're drunk, things like that. However, there is rarely a time and place where we are taught about sleep, about how important sleep is, and that we should be aware of that. So Walker tries to provide a basic understanding in his book, so we learn about sleep, better understand sleep, and we know all the positive effects it has and all the problems that arise from lack of sleep. And at least for me, this worked quite well. One thing I noticed that I liked, when I first got the book, I looked at the index, checked out what topics there are and so on, and I had a look at those 12 tips for better sleep at the very end, and it wasn't that exciting, because it was all things I already knew, like you have to go to bed and get up at fixed times, room should be dark and cool, and things like that. So, common knowledge. However, after I had read the book and after I reached these 12 tips for the second time, I noticed that now I much better understood what those 12 tips were actually about and the reason why they were important. And this I quite liked. This I found very positive. And the book also includes several pieces of information that I find to be important for myself. For example, this fact about old people not actually needing less sleep, but that they just have more difficulties getting it. Because I always believed that old people need less sleep, and this was always a bit of an excuse for myself. I thought, oh well, I don't get that much sleep, but I'm also getting older, and so I won't need as much. And yeah, it's good to know this isn't necessarily true. And I also found this study about attention and reaction times very interesting. First of all, the fact that the negative effects of lack of sleep, that they are not static, but that they get worse over time, and also the fact that we might not actually notice ourselves if we suffer from negative effects of lack of sleep. So this was also quite interesting. Now it applies to focus of attention and reaction times, but it might apply to other areas as well. So I think this could be quite important. And finally, another thing Walker mentions and explains is that this idea of catching up on sleep on the weekend after you've slept too little during the week, that this does not actually work and is not a good solution. I also found this important. So at this point, I would usually say, yeah, great book, recommend it, go read it, and so on. But unfortunately, there is a big problem here because there is some heavy criticism of this book centered around an article written by one Alexei Gazay. Gazay is a mathematician and an economist, so he knows statistics, and he is also interested in neuroscience and has acquired some knowledge about that. And he has had a look at the book, and he discovered that there are plenty of problems in the book, that Walker has frequently made mistakes. Now I can't discuss Gazay's article in detail here because the video will already be quite long and we shouldn't overdo it. So let me just briefly give you two examples. First one is not by Gazay himself, but a reader of his article noticed it and pointed it out. Walker describes a study. It worked like this. They took pictures of participants after good night of sleep, after not enough sleep. And they showed these pictures to other participants, and it turned out when the people hadn't slept enough, they were rated as looking exhausted, not looking healthy, and even as less attractive. Now, Walker described it like this: 8 hours of sleep, 5 hours of sleep. Actually, it was 8 hours of sleep plus being awake for 7 hours, and 5 hours of sleep plus being awake for 31 hours. So those people who looked like crap on the photos, they didn't just sleep for 5 hours instead of 8. They were awake for an entire night afterwards. And of course, the results of the study are much less exciting if you know that, because it's quite obvious you look bad if you had to stay awake an entire night. And another example that is way more problematic is about sleep deprivation and depression. Walker mentions briefly that people who suffer from depressions sometimes get better after they didn't have a lot of sleep, and that this actually makes the people temporarily less depressed. But he explains how it works, but then he kind of downplays it and says, oh, well, you can't do anything useful with it. However, as Alexei describes in his article, to deprive people who suffer from a depression of sleep in a limited and controlled way and as part of a therapeutic measure is something that is successfully done. And the therapeutic approaches that do this, they are accepted and established, and they get very good results. Now, this is obviously a big problem, because the situation all of this could lead to is that a person who suffers from depression will turn down a therapy that could actually help them and could actually improve their condition, because they have read the book and gotten the wrong impression about things. So this is quite a major problem. Now, Gazay's reasoning isn't always perfect either. As I said, I can't discuss the article in great detail here. One thing I found a bit difficult is Gazay's approach is that he took one chapter of the book and examined it in detail and pointed out all the mistakes it contains. Now, this is a valid approach, of course, because this took lots and lots of time. And evaluating the entire book in this way would have taken an excessive amount of time. However, the problem is Gazay selected the very first chapter, which seems obvious at first glance, but the problem is The first chapter, like in most books, is an introduction. So it is very general, very vague. Walker describes what the book is about, what the topic is, how the rest of the book is structured, why he is interested in the topic of sleep, and things like that. So it's all very general, and it's not like the later actual chapters where he really works with his materials and his sources and draws conclusions and things like that. So Gazay's analysis doesn't clearly show us which of Walker's arguments and conclusions and so on really are the flawed ones. So bottom line is, we can't really trust Walker's statements. There are probably some that are absolutely right, but there are also some that are exaggerated. So where the direction is correct, but the evidence, for example, is not as strong and clear as Walker makes it out to be. And there are probably some more that are outright wrong, like this sleep deprivation for depression thing. I wouldn't say that the book is entirely useless due to that. I think there are probably a few mistakes in most books that are as extensive as this one, but we clearly have to add a big question mark to all of Walker's statements, a bigger question mark than we would usually add. I think the general message that sleep is important, that it has many positive effects, that we should care for it and make sure that our sleep is good and healthy, that is certainly, I'm pretty certain this is correct, and Gazay also doesn't contradict that. But to learn more about sleep and get more details about sleep, I guess for that we keep looking for better sources. If you have any recommendations in that regard, feel free to let me know in the comments. So we will surely pick up this topic again here on the channel and try to learn more about sleep in the future. Now, due to the circumstances, I cannot recommend this book. Well, it was an exciting video in the making, you can probably imagine that. I hope the video turned out interesting for you. If you are still awake, I would appreciate a like, and I would be quite happy if you subscribe to the channel. We will see each other again next week in the next channel update. There I will also say a few more words about one or two things in regard to the book. But for now, I'll take my leave. Have a nice day. See you next time.